Well, you are most welcome to this video, whichever medium you happen to be watching it on. Hopefully we're on YouTube again next week, we sincerely hope. Delighted to welcome my friend Aseem Malhotra. Aseem is a physician, member of the Royal College of Physicians, has been appointed as a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, which is a very senior grade, consultant cardiologist, medical author, medical researcher, medical health campaigner of renown, and something I'm really quite jealous about, a Joe Rogan veteran. Aseem, welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Great to see you again, John.
So, Joe Rogan last week, how did it go?
I think it went very well. The feedback I've had has been really positive, very strongly positive. It was interesting. We had a 3-hour conversation. It flew by and talked about a lot of different areas around what's inhibiting, the population and patients optimizing their mental and physical health. And of course, I'm a root cause analysis guy. So we really talked around the whole failures in the system that are, driving people in the wrong direction, really.
I mean, are these just ideas you've dreamt up, Aseem, or is this based on some kind of
Yeah,
evidence?
well, it's interesting, John. So I started this journey probably, 20 years ago when I qualified as a doctor. I qualified from Edinburgh Medical School, and over the 10-year period since 2001, I was noticing, viscerally, working on the front line in hospital medicine, more and more people who were seemed to be getting sicker, and certainly not better anyway. We're getting more people with, chronic diseases, multiple medications, side effects from those medications. At the same time, we had this big issue, which was 2004, in fact, the World Health Organization announced obesity as a global pandemic issue. And we weren't making any inroads into tackling it. So that's where I really started my journey. But I think for me, John, the first and foremost, my primary duty is to my patients and trying to improve their health outcomes. So I always bring it back to something a very elegant analytical framework that we use for teaching and practicing medicine, which is called the evidence-based medicine triad. In fact, that was first published, that concept was published in 1996 in the BMJ. Lead author was the late now Professor David Sackett. And I really love this concept because it's quite easy to understand, but in a way it also helps us think about why are we not able to adhere to the principles of evidence-based medicine. So very simply, we want to improve patient outcomes, which means managing risks, treating illness and relieving suffering. And there are 3 sort of inputs into that. One is our clinical experience and intuition, our knowledge as healthcare practitioners, doctors, nurses, other healthcare allied professionals. Use of best available evidence on whatever we're looking at managing, whether it's use of pharmacological therapies, whether it's organizing tests, whether it's surgical interventions. And then last but not least is taking into consideration individual patient preferences and values. So if you start from that position, you think, actually, this makes a lot of sense. This is very, very a good way of thinking how we should practice medicine. And then you realize, well, if there's anything wrong with any of those 3 inputs or all of them, then what's going to happen is at best you're going to get suboptimal outcomes for your patients, and at worst you're going to do harm. So what if you just take, for example, one of those big sections, best available evidence, for me now, with all of my experience in this space and knowledge and understanding and research, evidence-based medicine, unfortunately, has become an illusion. It's become hijacked by a very powerful commercial interest because quite often, maybe more often than not now, doctors are making clinical decisions for patients on biased and corrupted information. So if you look at the best available evidence, I always cite somebody called John Ioannidis, who you may be familiar with, who I call him the Stephen Hawking-like figure of medicine. He's the most cited medical researcher in the world, professor of medicine at Stanford. And he published a paper in 2006, actually, in PLOS ONE, which was, it's quite extraordinary, the title, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. And he gives this mathematical analysis about replicability of research findings, about methods used in research, about the fact that one of the key things is, he says, the greater the financial interest in a particular field, the less likely the research findings is to be true, which I think is really interesting. So, when you look at and understand what's going on at the root, John, I think, my realization now is we've ultimately got a big conflict between the people who are influencing dissemination of information to doctors, entities such as Big Pharma, who are only interested in profit, not giving you the best treatment, versus our role as doctors, as nurses, as healthcare practitioners, where we are there to put the ethical care of the patient as a priority. And you've got an entity which often, not always, often in the way that they carry out their profit-making business, behave like psychopaths. And that's not being inflammatory. That comes actually from Robert Hare, forensic psychologist, who's a key figure behind the international DSM criteria for psychopathy. So it means,
diagnostic and statistical
absolutely,
manual.
So reckless disregard for the safety of others, lying, deceitfulness, conning others for profit, incapacity to experience guilt. So I think when you start with that and you think, well, actually, we need to get the roots of the issue addressed properly, then we can take ourselves on a journey, John, to actually optimizing people's health. And I'm also someone that believes in real democracy. And it's interesting when you look at international surveys about what's most important to people around the world, the number one issue is health, their health. And then it's followed by having a happy, whatever, family environment. So then let's define health. I'm not a big fan of the WHO at the moment for lots of reasons, because I think they're also very conflicted. But I love their definition of health: a state of complete mental, physical, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. So if we all get these precise definitions and we work our way backwards, I think we can find the roots of the problem, and then we can offer solutions. And just to finish on this particular bit, John, the reason we're talking about this is we have this massive burden of chronic disease now. So in this country, since 2010, in the UK, we've had a stalling in life expectancy, and in fact, a worsening of health because more people are living with chronic disease now. In the United States, in the last few years, they've lost 2 years from their average life expectancy. So I take a step back and think, as a doctor, and of course it's multifactorial, but if we are doing everything right and behaving and acting and practicing according to real evidence-based medicine that is free from commercial influence, why are our patients getting sicker?
I'd like to go back a bit to the general environment to look at this, Asim, if that's okay. In the United States and the United Kingdom, just to take two examples, I mean, are you fairly happy that people are getting a reasonably good diet for health?
No, unfortunately, not John. So if you look at the major issue right now in nutrition science, and it keeps evolving, of course. We had the thing about saturated fat that we realized that was wrong. Now I think people are accepting more and more now that sugar is a major issue. But I think the real focus, if you like, now, according to the best evidence in terms of what's probably, because a lot of theories have come out, what's driving obesity. For a while, the food industry pushed this issue of lack of exercise, when clearly exercise is great for health. I'm a big advocate for it, but has very little impact when it comes to weight. It's all diet. So things have kept evolving. But the major issue right now in our diet, John, is ultra-processed foods. So that's 50% of the calorie consumption in the UK's ultra-processed foods, about 60% in the US. And these are obviously two big countries in the Western world with very high obesity rates. So these are essentially designed by the food industry. They have cheap ingredients, unhealthy oils, sugar, starch, additives and preservatives. They make them hyper palatable, probably for many people addictive. And the reason why addiction is important is the opposite of free will. Think about what tobacco did.
Yeah.
And that's what's driving overconsumption of foods that are, poor in terms of their nutrition and ultimately just give us a lot of empty calories. And then that is a big factor driving weight gain and even insulin resistance, which for me as a cardiologist, I will tell you, is the single biggest risk factor for heart attacks. So yes, it's poor. It's very, very poor, John. And just to give people perspective in terms of hierarchy, I'm all for multiple interventions for patients in terms of lifestyle. But on a global scale now, the Lancet Global Burden of Disease report suggests that poor diet is responsible for more disease and death globally than physical inactivity, smoking, and alcohol combined in the present day. So that's really what we need to be focusing on from an individual level primarily, but also at policy level.
Uh-huh. So just a bit of remedial training for me, really. I mean, for years we've been taught about this whole cholesterol stuff, the Framingham study data. Can you just sketch out for us, please, the difference between cholesterol as a potential cause of disease and insulin resistance as a cause of disease, and what causes it and what the heck?
Yeah, it's a great question, John. So what's happened is because of flawed science, we've overly, I'm not saying cholesterol isn't involved in heart disease, but we've overly focused on it, thinking it was the main culprit in terms of driving heart disease, and therefore the solution should be to lower it as much as possible. When you go back to the original studies looking at where they found associations with cholesterol and heart disease, John, it was only really there at extremely high levels, a clear association, so over 10 millimoles per litre. Now, that in most cases are people who suffer from a condition called familial hyperlipidemia, which is a genetic condition that affects 1 in 250 people. And actually, even within that subset of people, 70% of women and 50% of men with FH, with very high levels of cholesterol that essentially they have from birth, will not develop premature heart disease. So I've done research and looked at that to try and figure out what is it that is actually driving heart disease at the root. And it comes down to primarily insulin resistance. So this is essentially when your body becomes resistant to the hormone insulin over time, often driven by chronically high insulin, which is rooted in diets that are ultra-processed foods or high or low-quality carbohydrates, if you like. So when you break down the data from different studies looking at who develops heart disease, probably 80% of those people who have diagnosed heart disease will have a degree of insulin resistance. And studies have suggested that if you combat insulin resistance primarily, then probably you would, have a significant impact more than anything on the incidence, prevalence of heart disease and even heart attacks. So that should be the focus. When people talk about cholesterol, John, they come back to the LDL cholesterol. So this is, low density lipoprotein, part of the cholesterol profile. And that, again, isn't straightforward. So, the levels at which there is a strong association with heart disease are above 4.9. But interestingly, once you correct your triglycerides and HDL, other parts of the cholesterol profile, which also are markers of insulin resistance, the LDL doesn't really significantly become a risk factor. So what I'm saying is there is an association at very high levels. The next question is, even if there's an association, what's the best solution? Is it taking cholesterol-lowering pills? Is it lowering the LDL cholesterol? And in general, I would say that's misguided. I would focus on the insulin resistance, and the situation will probably correct itself irrespective of what your LDL is. To muddy the waters further, John, what's interesting is we also have forgotten that actually cholesterol has an important role in the immune system. And
Yes.
I was involved in a systematic review looking at people over 60 to find, was there any association with LDL cholesterol? This is published in BMJ Open, so people can look that up if they like, it's open access. Was there any association with LDL cholesterol and heart disease if you're over 60? And there was none, and we were a bit surprised that we thought there might be a weak association, but there was none. But interestingly, there was an inverse association with total and LDL cholesterol and early death. So in other words, statistically, the higher your cholesterol over 60, the less likely you are to die. And the reasons for that probably, obviously these things evolve and you can't always find a definitive answer all the time. But the most likely explanation we have at the moment is that older people, John, people over 60 are more vulnerable to dying from infections like pneumonia. And therefore, there's a protective effect probably with high cholesterol from those sorts of conditions. And also, there is a very strong association, John, with low cholesterol and cancer. Now, that's an association again, but again, it probably links into the immune system. So this obsession with managing heart disease, focusing on the wrong thing in a way that became reductionist, that we just focus on low cholesterol and forget about anything else, ironically, has actually in some ways driven the obesity epidemic, because one of the ways you lower LDL is cutting out fat and saturated fat from your diet. And automatically what happens when you do that, you will end up increasing your consumption of carbohydrates. Now, not all carbohydrates are bad. I mean, whole fruit and vegetables I'm a big advocate for. I probably get through 7 to 10 portions a day. But it's really the refined carbs, the breads, the pastas, the rice, the sugar. And that has contributed massively to the increasing prevalence of type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, which is a cluster of risk factors, again, strongly associated with heart disease. So ironically, in theory, say a patient comes in, and I've seen this happen, and they're told by their doctor, they want to manage heart disease, prevent heart disease, or even if they've got a bit of furring, they want to, prevent a heart attack in the future. They're told to focus everything on lowering their cholesterol. They take a pill, they've got an illusion of protection to some degree from the pill, and then they end up going eating, high carbohydrate foods. They get their blood test saying their cholesterol's low, and then they have a heart attack, and they're like, well, what's happening? And this actually happens. It's actually a phenomenon that happens. So in some ways, by focusing on lowering cholesterol, we might be actually increasing people's heart disease risk.
So I actually worked on coronary care in the 1980s. Your dad probably told you about this, Asim. And we used to have people in several times a shift with the most appalling huge heart attacks, huge amounts of what we call the ST elevation, really bad heart attacks. And a lot of those people were
Yes.
smokers. Not all, but a lot were smokers. Smoking is now much less, so the percentage of people smoking is way less. So I think now that smoking has been, to some extent, well recognised, the next battle to fight is this insulin resistance battle. That seems to be the next big factor. People are eating lots of refined carbohydrates and sugars. They're forcing the pancreas to chuck out loads of insulin, and that's essentially wearing out their insulin receptors. You get what you call down regulation of insulin receptors. And that's what's causing this insulin resistance. And like me, you'll have given patients insulin. And just to give a bit of background here, if I take about 3 or 4 units of insulin as a healthy person, I'd probably become shaky, hypoglycemic, and crave carbohydrates. But we've given doses of 40, 50, 60, 70 units of insulin to people with insulin resistance because they just need that because they're so resistant to the insulin. It's this huge problem. And it's got all these metabolic sequelae that are killing so many people. Is that basically
and John, I think you're talking about obviously some of these type 2 diabetics that come in with very high, glucose, and you have to then get their glucose normalized with insulin, and because the outcomes actually are better once you in an acute situation when they're very, very sick.
Yeah. No, I'm actually thinking of it is people who've had diabetes for a long period of time that become immensely insulin resistant.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they need a lot of insulin to bring the blood sugar
Absolutely,
even down
John.
bit.
So I think what's interesting on that, this is fascinating. I researched this and I mentioned it when I wrote my book. I think it was in the immunity plan that I wrote, or it was maybe, or even a Statin Free Life. I mentioned it a couple of times. What's fascinating about this, if you look at type 1 diabetics who rely on insulin to survive, without insulin they would die. Now, even the ones with the best glucose control have an average life expectancy 10 years less than normal. So the question, what's going on there? And I think that is the fact, you're absolutely right, the chronically high insulin is directly toxic, if you like, to the inner lining of the heart arteries. It causes endothelial damage and endothelial dysfunction. So what that means is a lot of people, I know one GP, in fact, he's called Ian Lake, he's brilliant. He's actually type 1 diabetic himself. And he is on a very, very low carbohydrate diet now, and he prescribes that for his patients. And those type 1 diabetics are needing much, much less insulin, even to, and I think it's probably going to be a good thing for them. But in general, yes, what's the good news, John, however, is, and this is data comes from an organization in the United States called Verta. They published data on hundreds of patients where they put them on a low carbohydrate diet. These people who had type 2 diabetes who were on insulin, and some of them on other medications, 94% of them were able to come off of their insulin within, several months of just going low carbohydrate, which is extraordinary. And patients weren't that. They're happy they're not taking insulin anymore. And there was a massive, almost 50% of them, I think, actually sent their type 2 diabetes into remission off medications within about a year. And a lot of that impact happens very quickly. I've had patients within weeks can actually come off their medications, type 2 diabetes, just going on a low carb. I advocate a low carb Mediterranean diet. That's where I think the focus should be. But yes, absolutely, John, that is the major issue. And what's interesting is, I think you mentioned tobacco. There are some parallels with tobacco in a way that, you think back now, 1970, you will remember this. It's extraordinary now. 50% of UK adults were smokers, right? 50%. Now it's about, I think, 17%. So massive reduction.
Yeah, I think it's 17.
And now you think about, hold on a minute, 50% of smokers, 50%, of our diet is ultra-processed foods. So I absolutely think that we should be focusing on that through education. But of course, the biggest, I told this to Joe Rogan last week, and he was shocked. I said the biggest healthcare breakthrough we've had in the last five decades is a taxation on cigarettes. Because it decreases the effective availability of these products. You raise the price, less consumption. It feeds into the idea there's something harmful, and it forces a big change in behavior. I think we should do the same thing to ultra-processed foods. Let's tax them and also make healthy foods more affordable, so that But that's really, you're right. That's the major issue right now when it comes to diet and probably obesity and chronic disease, for sure.
And just educating people. We need lots of fruit and lots of a diversity of vegetables and Personally, I'm eating eggs again and trying to cut down on beer, carbohydrates, bread, rice, white rice particularly. It's a process. I'm working on it. I wouldn't say I'm quite there yet, but I'm working on it. Largely thanks to your advice, it has to seem. So progress is being made gradually. So it's almost as if there's this vested interest, financial vested interest in getting us all to stuff all this ultra-processed food down our mouths all the time. I mean, that figure for the United States, 60% of calories from ultra-processed food, absolutely incredible.
Yeah, no, it's mental. And I think people need to also realize that, you know, I very much believe in good government, and I want a medical establishment to be working for the interests of patients. But these industries, big food, big pharma, have captured a lot of those agencies and individuals. And I remember, you know, it wasn't that long ago. I remember I met with, I won't name her, people can look it up, but, you know, it was the chief nutritionist of Public Health England, which is now UKHSA. And I just asked her the question. I said, listen, with all these, fine, there are going to be creative disagreements about dietary patterns and what's, you know, good for health. But I said, if you look at the Eat Well guide, which is supposed to represent, you know, the healthy diet in the UK, and you can see the Eat Well guide. You go to hospitals in the UK, and you can see this picture of this Eat Well guide. This, you know, it used to be an Eat Well plate, and now it's got a guide with a plate in the middle, and this is how much proportion of your food should be from starch and all that kind of stuff. And I think there's a problem there because a lot of it's starch. But the one thing I thought is not debatable is, I asked this person, why on there in the corner have you got crisps and chocolates and cakes in there? And they've just put a very vague statement underneath: eat less often and in small amounts. So first and foremost, the British Journal of Sports Medicine, Zoe Harcombe is a public health nutritionist, she's brilliant. She actually published a paper, and it was something along the lines of, this plate was designed for industry wealth, not people's health. And they looked at the people who were involved in making up, when they went to looking at reviewing this guidance, who were the people involved in deciding what should go on this so-called Eat Well guide. And there were representatives from Mars and Coca-Cola and McDonald's, and I thought, this is a bit odd. But anyway, I asked this nutritionist, who's a lead government figure in nutrition, why is it even on there at all? It shouldn't be on there because it's kind of legitimizing it. Fine, listen, I'm not a bloody food fascist, you know. People can enjoy treats. I like treats like anyone else. It's just a proportion of amount of treats people are consuming has gone up. But I said it shouldn't be on the Healthy Eat Well guide. And the response was this, John. It says, Asim, you've got to understand one of the biggest contributors to our economy is the food industry. That comes from someone who is supposed to be representing independent evidence when it comes to food and health. And that was the answer.
You know, my posters that are doing the background scene, follow the evidence and all that kind of thing. I'm going to do a new one. Eat well for health, not for wealth.
I love that. I love that.
These are free to download. We've had hundreds of thousands of downloads. So that slogan could be on toilet walls all around the world in the next.
I love it. I love it. That reminds
weeks.
me of actually a quote from Mahatma Gandhi, and he says, "It is health that is the real wealth, not pieces of gold and silver."
Yeah.
And certainly not pieces of gold and silver for industries that profit from lying to people, you know.
Yeah, and I've come across many shrouds in my career, and it's true there is no pockets in them. You
absolutely,
can't take
mate, 100%.
Yeah. So there's this vested interest that we find at best deeply uncomfortable in the food industry. Does this extend to the pharmaceutical industry? It seems to me that all the drugs that are coming out, you just take one a day for the rest of your life. Yeah, I mean, if you think,
which is kind of it is, and they're not, you know, they're unapologetic about it. John, I in 2018, I went and to the Cambridge University Union, and I was asked to be on a panel to debate with AstraZeneca, and the motion that was put forward in the debates by them was, we need more people taking more drugs. And they tried to convince us that was a very good idea. But of course, from a business perspective, that makes complete sense. You know, they want to ideally get babies on drugs they can take for the rest of their life. But, you know, it's not, we can see the net effect of that. Right now, we've got this massive problem with an over-medicated population. One estimate from Peter Gosha, the co-founder of the Cochrane collaboration, is that prescribed medications globally is the third most common cause of death after heart disease and cancer because of avoidable side effects. So for me, the over-medicated population is a public health crisis, but industry, of course, see it as an opportunity to make more money. And therefore, that's what they're going to try and push. But the problem is they've got more power and control than they've ever had over academic institutions. Most of the funding of medical research now comes from industry, pharma industry. Regulators, for example, in our country, the MHRA gets 86% of its funding from pharma, the FDA in America, 65%. So I think people need to understand these system failures and who's really calling the shots and what are their interests and how do they influence those organizations that we ultimately, as doctors, most doctors trust their regulators and they trust the guideline bodies. They don't know of these system failures. Ioannidis points that out. He says the reason that this problem perpetuates itself, not because doctors are malicious and they don't want to help. Most doctors go into profession because and nurses want to really genuinely help their patients get better. But the problem is that we have automatically trusted what's written in the Lancet and taken it as biblical gospel truth. And in fact, on the Lancet, Richard Horton, 2015, it's a great article that people look up and read online, John. It's called What is Medicine's Five Sigma? And Richard Horton himself talks about a Chatham House Rules meeting that takes place with the Wellcome Trust in London. And he says, I'm not going to attribute this to any particular person, but some of the world's top scientists were gathered here. And he said, possibly half of the published medical literature may simply be untrue. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. And he says science has taken a turn towards darkness. So who's going to take the first step to clean up the system? So for me, I kind of saw it as a rallying call. I want to, it's we all have a role in this. So I said, well, what can I do? What's the best possible thing I can do to help push this agenda? And in fact, 2015, through a bit of private advocacy work, I was working with the medical Royal Colleges and I convinced them, because of a campaign that was started by the BMJ in 2012 called Too Much Medicine, I said to the Royal Colleges, I think it'd be a very good idea that the medical Royal Colleges join with the BMJ and start a campaign called Choosing Wisely in order to wind back the harms of too much medicine. And it talks about some of these structural failures. It talks about medical training as well. We need to be better as doctors at critical appraising the evidence and knowing the system failures. And then what's really interesting is translating information in a way that patients can understand when it comes to benefits of medications in absolute terms. So if you take statins, for example, you look at this is one of the most lucrative prescribed drugs in the history of medicine, offered to about 1 billion people worldwide. Supposed to be the miracle drug in preventing heart disease and even reversing heart disease in the population, which it hasn't really done. And one of the reasons for that is when you break down the numbers, even from industry-sponsored trials, the benefits are very, very modest or marginal. You're talking about low risk of heart disease. You're giving a 1% chance to people over 5 years and preventing a non-fatal heart attack. They're not prolonging their life. And that's even before you get into side effects, which probably affects, anything in my experience. When I mean quality of life limiting side effects, not life threatening, but things like fatigue and muscle aches and, memory disturbance and stomach upset and all that kind of stuff. Erectile dysfunction's one, probably affects maybe at least 20 to 50% of people at some point in their life. And then people stop taking the pills of their own volition because they don't feel well. And that proportion is very high, John. And therefore, we're not really, making progress with the use of statins in the best way. Simultaneously, doctors are not having conversations with their patients about nutrition and lifestyle, again, because we're not trained in it. I learned this after I left medical school, about how these simple approaches can be very powerful and rapid in helping patients. So for me, I think you can explain all of these problems actually quite simply, but people need to understand the system failures that are perpetuating this public health crisis, and that's what we've got.
And we have a word for this in medicine, Asim, don't we? Iatrogenesis. Yeah. It's recognised. We have a word caused by the doctor, a whole range of things, and it's just what I'd like drugs that were much more curative. So I'd like to take one pill and be cured for life rather than taking a pill every day for the rest of my life. But it seems to me that the research which is being sponsored at the moment is research which is treating the symptoms of disease. You just take a pill every day for the rest of your life. So my blood pressure's been a bit higher for the last 18 months or so than I'd like it to be. And I have to take a medicine at the moment. I'm working on lifestyle factors, but at the moment it's kind of every day for the rest of my life. Now, imagine that some young doctor came along and said, for example, Barry Marshall came along and said something very similar in 1990 in Australia about the eradication of the Helicobacter pylori that causes the peptic ulceration. he came along and said, well, look, this treatment could cure the disease, not take a pill every day for the rest of your life. So if some clever young researcher comes to a big pharma and says, look, I've got this new treatment, it'll involve taking one pill and I think John's blood pressure will be cured for life, then it seems to me that big pharma aren't likely to sponsor that research because they don't want to sell me one pill. They want to send me one pill a day for the rest of my life. So it seems as this sort of almost like a natural selection against curative treatments.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, very often in medicine, we're not carrying out interventions that are curative, especially pharmacological. We're carrying out interventions that are relieving the symptoms. And that seems to be a big part of the problem, that we're only selecting the research to do that has got a potential financial return, not the research to do that's got a potential health benefit for me, which I'd like. Thank you very much.
John, in fact, on that note, it's interesting you raised that point, because that applies to the issue. One of the big issues we have right now is antibiotic resistance. And therefore, the drug industries, drug companies are not investing much resources into that because, of course, antibiotics for an infection, you might take them for 5 days quite often, and it sorts it out, but it's not profitable. And that's a big, big problem.
And it's other infections around the world. I mean, to me, one of the huge injustices around the world has been the amount of children that still die regularly. I've come across this on a personal contact basis recently in Africa from malaria. Because you've got a group of people that can't pay a lot of money for the treatment, then why bother doing research on it? The financial return is not there, and yet there's this tremendous burden of morbidity and mortality from a disease which I'm sure we could treat if we really got our act together. And it just seems a pity that the big research projects are things that are going to make lots of money potentially for pharmaceutical industries, and it's just. Morally, I find that to be offensive.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I think that that conversation needs to be had, isn't it? Is what's happened to our culture? I've come up with this term calling the psychopathic determinants of health, because these entities do behave in a psychopathic way quite often. But what's the downstream effects of that? And the downstream effects of that is it erodes our ability to, as healthcare practitioners, to adhere, or it makes it harder for us to adhere to medical ethics, if you like. It sounds strange, but that also means acting with integrity. There's something called the 7 Nolan Principles of Public Life that was set up in the 90s. I remember when I was a trustee of the King's Fund, and we had to sign a document saying you would adhere to the 7 Nolan Principles. And it hadn't clocked to me at that point. I mean, I like to think I always try and behave with integrity anyway, but it was very nicely defined. And the 7 principles, and they apply to doctors, teachers, police officers, and even politicians. Anyone who has a duty to serve the public should adhere to them. And those 7 principles, and I memorized them, right? Selflessness, objectivity, integrity, accountability, honesty, openness, and leadership. And leadership also means pointing out when poor behavior occurs. So I obsess about that, John. I honestly obsess about that I have to always try and adhere to those. And that's why I speak out, because, and it's not easy, as right now the environment is such that speaking the truth is not safe. But the rational approach is not speaking the truth is even less safe, because the problem isn't going to go away, and often is probably only going to get worse, and you dealt with a much harder issue to deal with.
Yeah. Well,
7 Nolan Principles of Public Life.
Nolan, right?
Yes.
We'll look up a reference. Now, I've got a nice thick book here. I think it's the last paper copy.
Yes,
you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
So this is all the drugs that doctors are allowed to prescribe. Now, very often doctors will look at protocols and prescribe drugs based on this. And this says you can use various drugs for various purposes. Now, what does it mean if doctors are prescribing things off license? Does that mean it's for a reason other than what is given in the British National Formulary? Would that be an off license?
I think that's correct, John. I don't fully understand that. I think also off license probably means that it hasn't been approved for being used in a very specific scenario or condition. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, if there was a molecule that you thought was beneficial, and you were seeing someone in an
Yes.
official capacity, you couldn't really prescribe that, could you? Because you can only prescribe what
Yeah,
is
that's
in this
absolutely
book.
true. I know it's a big issue in America. It's interesting you asked that question. I just wonder whether I don't think I've ever found myself in that position where I've had to prescribe a drug for somebody which wasn't licensed for a particular. It doesn't mean that it doesn't. There aren't drugs out there, and there aren't good doctors who are using them. I've personally never been in that situation, to be honest. I mean, I spend a
Yeah.
lot of my time now, John, to be honest, getting people off pills. So my focus, I've got a bias there. I think I go there thinking how can I get this,
Yeah. Yeah.
because that's what patients want. Actually, they want to be on less pills and have a lifestyle plan instead. So it's not something that I've personally had
Yeah.
experience with.
But most doctors
Yeah.
will just prescribe what is in here because they prescribe something else, then their livelihood's at stake. But of course, what is in here is what is produced by the
Yes.
pharmaceutical industry,
Yeah.
by definition. And what is produced by the pharmaceutical industry is very often what has been researched
Yes.
by that very
Abs-
same
and also
pharmaceutical
on that
industry.
note, you see the way that we now know that they disseminate their information, what we have considered traditionally as being reliable, is ultimately an exaggeration of the benefits and safety of those drugs. So you'll see, so if we take statins, for example, we were told that less than 1% of people get anything of any significance in terms of side effects. The real world data suggests something massively, different to that, much more. And then when you look at when you do the root cause analysis and look at the reliability of the information where this has come from, it's commercially confidential. It's been kept commercially confidential by the drug industry.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
we are making clinical
yeah,
decisions on non-transparent information. So I think having that understanding, it doesn't mean you can't practice medicine, but there's all these caveats. And part of being a good doctor and engaging in shared decision making with patients is bringing in uncertainty into the conversation to say, listen, this is the best available evidence. However, there are a few things we should be aware of. For example, and I have this conversation with patients all the time, and they like it. They actually like to hear that the doctor says, listen, drug industry's interests are different to ours, so I would take this with an element or a pinch of salt. I still think, in my opinion, as a doctor with experience, this is the right way for you, but understand the absolute benefits and the harms, and then I'm here to help you through that process.
yeah. I want the primary data from these drug trials, not so that I can analyze it myself, I can't, but I do know half a dozen world-class statisticians and they can analyze it for us, and give us the definitive data. And I want it to be absolutely clear when we're talking about a
Yes.
relative risk and an
Yes.
absolute risk, because so often we're given relative risk comparing treatment A with treatment B, whereas my absolute risk of getting a particular disease might be 0.1% or something. But when you're looking at the relative risk between two treatments, it could be a 50%
Yes.
difference, a 60%
Yeah.
difference. And these are very simple research principles. And it would be really unfortunate if anyone were to manipulate those for financial
It was very
advantage.
unfortunate, but that's what they've done. I mean, that's exactly what they've done. So, for people to understand in simple terms, if you've got a clinical trial and you're following about, 100 people in the placebo arm who didn't take the pill, let's say statins, for example, right? And over a 5-year period, 2 of those people on the dummy pill had a stroke, right? And then the people who took the statins, only 1 had a stroke. You've reduced the relative risk as a 50% reduction in stroke, right? 1 in 2 times 100. You've reduced it by 1 out of 2. But the absolute risk reduction, you've only saved 1 person out of 100 from having a stroke. So that's only 1%. But that's a more honest way of breaking down the information. In fact, that is also from the medical Royal Colleges, and something that even the World Health Organization in 2009 in a bulletin said, that it's an ethical imperative that you understand and explain the absolute risk reduction to patients. But that isn't commonplace, John, at all. It's not. We're not conditioned. We're not trained to do that. So that's another low-hanging fruit of something that I think would improve transparency. But again, even that data, John, is on non-transparent information, because that's what the drug industry are telling us. So that is probably still likely an exaggeration, because what they do is they design the trials where they will underplay the side effects issue, and select patients that are most likely to benefit. Because it's not just about the results. They design the trials in a way that they think is going to give them the best outcome, right? So the whole thing is biased from the beginning. So I'm completely with you. Independent analysis Even to be honest, they can develop drugs. I think drug industry. I've recommended this, but I don't think they should be allowed to test them themselves and then hold on to the raw data. I think they should have independent people who are designing trials that are going to give you the most likely, accurate scenario on the benefits and harms. And then the guideline bodies, again, shouldn't be taking money from industry. And that's why, for me, as I move forward, one of the tools, John, that people, I think, as an educational tool is the power of movies or documentaries. 2015, I co-produced this documentary called The Big Fat Fix, which actually explained the whole issue around cholesterol and what we should be doing in terms of lifestyle, ideally looking at an Italian village called Pioppi in southern Italy, which is the home of the Mediterranean diet, and try to help people and empower them to think about their health in a better way. And we crowdfunded it and we premiered it in British Parliament and to influence policymakers as well. And it had a role to play, certainly, in the sugary drinks tax, because I know a lot of politicians watch it. Tom Watson, who you may remember, former Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, he contacted me and said he lost £100 following the diet plan, which was essentially in that book, but he was empowered. He's doing really well. So we are now about to do another one. I don't know if this is a good time to sort of briefly talk about it. Yeah, go for it. Donal O'Neill, who's a very experienced sort of director and producer, he's a former international athlete, done many documentaries. I co-produced the previous one with him. We had a discussion. We thought, actually, this discussion we're having today, John, around this whole issue about pharma and lack of transparency and informed consent and breaking information down, whether it's blood pressure pills or statins, said we should do a documentary on this. So we're in the middle of crowdfunding it now. We want to film it in the summer. It's called First Do No Farm, as in PHARM, and really to get to the root of the issue, to then help individuals and policymakers with solutions moving forward. And, we've got people like Jay Bhattacharya, John Abramson, who's a Harvard doctor. He was also interviewed by Joe Rogan. He's been more than anyone over the years involved in litigation against drug companies and actually exposing all of what goes on and the manipulations they do. But also some amazing case studies of patients that have transformed their lives from coming off pills, even having had a heart attack and adopting a lifestyle approach and doing really well. So we want it to be inspiring and educational. So we're just in the process of sort of crowdfunding for that, and then hopefully we'll get it out early next year. And Joe Rogan himself said he's going to promote it, which is great. So let's see how that goes.
Well, having been on Joe Rogan, I'm delighted and somewhat amazed you've come onto my channel, Asim. So thank you for that. And I believe we can end with a clip now of that video.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a promotional video just to give people a kind of an idea of what we're doing, and if they're interested, people can contribute for the crowdfunding. The reason we're doing the crowdfunding, obviously, it does cost money to produce these films, to get the crew, to travel, all of the editing and that kind of stuff. I mean, I have a bit of a role to play, obviously, in that as a co-producer. But people can go to nofarmfilm.com and have a look and contribute whatever they feel they can. And we want it funded by the public for the public. So no commercial influence here. We're not selling any products. We're not promoting any particular drug or whatever else. And that's what we want. We want clean information as best as possible for people. And onwards and upwards.
And I assume that the large pharmaceutical industries aren't interested in.
Well, I don't think so. One of the things I said before, the interesting thing, John, is if we actually adhere to the principles of ethical evidence-based medicine, it's a massive threat to the drug industry, because when patients are fully informed, they tend to take less pills and choose less surgical interventions and procedures, even heart stents, for example. So, yes. I think, but this is what, we have to come back to our role. Our primary role is to help. This is what patients want. They want somebody with integrity. They want clean information. And the drug industry, ultimately, I think if the system changes, you've talked about this earlier, we need to incentivize them to do the right thing. And doing the right thing means actually producing curative drugs or better antibiotics. So I think it's in their interest as well to be part of this change, because at the moment, not being part of the solution makes them part of the problem, and they're a big, big part of the problem.
So we'll close with that clip now, Asim. Thank you very much for coming on. Remember, do not take any drugs, stop taking any drugs, or start taking any drugs as a result of this purely academic discussion. That's for you and your doctor. We're not giving any advice on that. Eat well for health, not for wealth. Over to the clip. Asim,
thank you, John.
Thank you very much.
The most important, I think, the best documentary you can, no holds barred, and exposing all of this commercial corruption, but also giving people solutions.
Well, when it comes out, we'll be happy to promote it.
Our medical regulators have been captured. Big Pharma is more powerful, profitable, and prolific than any other time in human history. The numbers are so vast that we cannot quite comprehend the extent of the damage and what it all means. And that is why I'm co-producing my second feature-length documentary, First Do No Farm, to show the public exactly how our collective health has been bartered, bought, and sold for decades now. If you're wondering what we must do collectively and how we must respond individually in a world pruned of health and primed for profit, this is the movie with all the answers. We are currently in pre-production, and with your support, we plan to start filming in the home of Big Pharma, the United States, during the summer months. This is a movie that would have been muzzled 12 months ago. But with Elon Musk behind Twitter and Joe Rogan's endorsement, we are now in a position to step into a story that needs to be told. Please support us if you can, share if you agree, and keep an open mind if you're not willing to do either yet. Thank you.
In 1986, Ronald Reagan made it easier for American pharma companies to make more money. And in 1992, George Bush allowed them to spend some of that to directly finance the FDA. By 1999, drug giant Merck had falsified their own research to usher a new arthritis drug onto the market. Vioxx would kill an estimated 55,000 Americans. But that was just for starters. In the last 2 decades, Big Pharma has been fined tens of billions of dollars. But the deception continues. When they are free to deceive, who can you believe?
Please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Malhotra. They paid fines that were minuscule in comparison to the profit that they made. And nobody got fired, and the system just continues to do the same thing. Nothing has changed to stop them committing these crimes again. Top executives should be held personally accountable so that they would need to think of the risk of imprisonment when they consider performing or acquiescing in these crimes.